The Sabbath, as classically understood in Judaism, or for that matter, the Sabbath as classically understood in Christianity, which is a rather different matter, went into steep decline 200, 250 years ago with the Enlightenment, what in Jewish history tends to be called the emancipation, the increasing civic enfranchisement of the Jews, and the increasing possibilities of economic opportunities and social integration and all the cultural pressures that that necessarily brings with it. So it's in that sense, whereas the vast majority of Jews would have been quite Sabbath observant 250 years ago, today it's a minority. So there's a whole set of social, economic, intellectual reasons, legal reasons, so why that became the case.
Dynamic biblical discussions with special guests exploring tough biblical issues, academic scholarship, ethics, archaeology, textual criticism, Old Testament, New Testament, Bible interpretation, apocalyptic literature, Christian history, ancient Near East cultures. You're tuned in to Conversations with Pastor Cliff on Puluso Ministries.
Good day, everybody. Welcome back to another episode on Puluso Ministries with myself, Pastor Cliff. Today we have an awesome guest. His name is no stranger to our channel, Jon Levenson from Harvard University. Welcome, Jon, to Puluso Ministries.
Thank you so much for having me back. I always enjoy our conversations. I wouldn't quite say I'm awesome, but I'll take it for now.
I know our audience love you, and you one of our best. So we certainly hope we're going to have an awesome conversation on the Sabbath. So the book that you recently authored on the Sabbath, perhaps before we dive right into our conversation, if you could tell us what actually inspired you to write this book in particular, and how is it fitting to your broader scholarship in your interest in Hebrew Bible and Jewish theology?
Well, for a long time, I gave a course called the Jewish Liturgical Year, which was a 2-semester course. But the first holiday that we examined was the Sabbath. People often think that the Sabbath is routine. It is routine, it's also sacred, and it's every bit as important as any other Jewish holiday. So you might say the Jews have a major holiday every week. After every 6 days, there is a major Jewish holiday. On the other hand, I don't think the Sabbath is well understood either by Jews or by non-Jews in today's world. And I thought it was time to fill in some of those gaps. Now, there exist a lot of books on the Sabbath. They tend to be either very spiritualistic and therefore ahistorical, rather historically naive or uninformed, or uncritical, often apologetic, often rather ignorant of the whole ancient Near Eastern world, on the one hand, or they tend to be very practical in Jewish terms, halachic, focusing on what one has to do to observe the Sabbath. Scholarly books, on the other hand, tend to be very hyper-focused on particular periods, and they tend to be devoid of a spiritual dimension and oblivious to or even hostile to theology, usually just oblivious to theology. So I thought I would fill in the gap. And, the conversation, the topic here is not new to me. I wrote an earlier book called Creation and Persistence of Evil, which deals with creation, obviously, and another couple of books, on covenant, Sinai and Zion, the love of God, and both creation and covenant are major aspects of the ancient Israelite, or for that matter, the contemporary Jewish Sabbath. So, from my point of view, my focus has always tended to be on Jewish theology, ideally informed by or focused on the key ancient texts, the foundational texts of Judaism, and then reflecting theologically on the practices that come out of those texts and are energized by those texts, and in turn help enlighten the text to modern readers.
Uh-huh. That sounds very captivating. But now I want to ask you, Jon, you have titled this book the Sabbath as a day of light and joy. Could you perhaps elaborate why you chose those particular descriptors and how they capture the essence of the Sabbath?
The name actually comes from a Sabbath table hymn that's sung on Friday night in traditional Jewish households. Yom Zel Yisrael Ora V'Simcha. This is a day to Israel, meaning the people of Israel, the Jewish people, a day of light and joy. And that in turn echoes certain wording that occurs in a different context in the book of Esther. Light, of course, has to do with the presence of God, with redemption, illumination, including the illumination that comes from the study of Torah. Joy defines the day in which the Jews are to act as if all their work is done, without concern for the past, without anxiety about the future. In other words, it's what the rabbis call a foretaste of the world to come. Talmudic sources refer to the Sabbath as a kind of foretaste of the world to come, a world without regret about the past, and a world without anxiety about the future. Very utopian, very unrealistic, but it's a little bit of that world to come injected into the weekly routine. So, although the Sabbath involves some very big changes in the way most people live their lives and conduct their week, if they're actually become Sabbath observant, if it's practiced in the traditional way, it's not a gloomy ascetic day. It's actually is or soon becomes a day of delight and spiritual replenishment. And therefore, I thought Israel's Day of Light and Joy might capture all those aspects of the day. Its specialness to the people of Israel, to the Jewish people, it's the delight and the spiritual replenishment that go along with the practice of the Sabbath.
Uh-huh. Tell me, you mentioned a particular term. You said simcha.
Right.
Maybe some of our audience may not, be proficient in Hebrew. What does that concept mean, simcha?
Simcha means joy. Often in the Bible, it has a sense of willingness, favor, eagerness to accommodate the divine will. Uh, and so I think the best term would be joy or gladness or something like that, uh, as the meaning it tends to have in classical Judaism. So that's where I get the word joy in Israel's Day of Light and Joy.
That makes sense. Now, in your book, you trace the origin of the Sabbath back into the Hebrew Bible. And how do you reconcile the different presentations of the Sabbath, particularly in the Torah, for example, where we have a contrast of Exodus 20, where the Sabbath is linked to creation, and also in the book of Deuteronomy, you have an association of the Sabbath to the Exodus. How do you deal with those different presentations?
Very, very good question. A typically learned question, Pastor Cliff. Well, there is a contradiction between the commandment, the Sabbath commandment in Exodus 20 and in Deuteronomy 5, as you mentioned. In Exodus 20, the basis for the Sabbath is the creation of the world in 6 days, with God stopping or resting on the seventh day. In Deuteronomy 5, the rationale for the Sabbath never mentions anything about creation or a 6-day pattern of creation, anything like that, but rather has to do with the Exodus, and especially the special solicitude for slaves. And don't forget, you were a slave whom the Lord your God brought you out of the land of Egypt, according to Deuteronomy 5. So these are different sources. I think the intellectually honest historian should not try to harmonize them. The intellectually honest historian should not try to do exegetical acrobatics to get these two things to line up and say they really are the same thing. They're different sources, but they've come together in one common scripture. In other words, the more complex answer isn't just, oh, they come from different periods, leave them in their separate periods. The more complex and sophisticated answer recognizes that these different sources from different periods or different particular social sectors have now come together in a literary form into these distinct sources, into what is now a unitary phenomenon. It's a unitary text that we now have. And as the rabbinic sources put it, these things were spoken b'dibur echad. They were spoken in one utterance. That's impossible for a human being to do, to say two very different things in one utterance, and to hear two different things in one utterance. But that is the claim of supernatural revelation that's made to explain, to account for the simultaneous reality of these two different explanations for the Sabbath. So the Sabbath is about God's authorship of the world, and also about his kindness to the people of Israel in the Exodus, which explains why Israel, the Jews, should not work their slaves or their employees for that matter, or even their farm animals for that matter, on that special day. Now, what I do think is the case is that if you look at some ancient Near Eastern literature, some Mesopotamian literature, you can narrow the gap between these two ideologies of the Sabbath, one based in creation and one based in the Exodus. Because in some of those texts, creation is a kind of liberation from the tyranny of chaos and a liberation for the lesser gods from the miserable drudgery that then is inflicted on this new creature, the human being. In the Bible, the new creature in Genesis 1 is not some sort of miserable, lowly peon. The new creature is created in the image of God. In Genesis 1, it's only human beings who are created in the image of God, or the gods, and they have a kind of lofty, almost regal status in which they're ruling over the other animals. So there is a kind of liberation aspect to creation, such that the difference between Exodus 20 and Deuteronomy 5 may not be quite as great as it seems to us, but they are different texts with different conceptions behind them.
Uh-huh. I like the fact that you make a distinction between, the term, I think Elohim, the gods, or the gods. Some people may not actually capture that there's a slight nuance in the Hebrew Bible where you have different presentations of a deity. But you also touch on the fact that different scholars have pointed out that the Sabbath itself originates from Mesopotamia, and how do you engage with such theories on how these biblical, how the Sabbath itself may stand as a distinct or unique in when you compare it to Mesopotamian theories, or how other scholars have argued in the past?
Well, that's a very scholarly question. It gets into some very technical matters. There is a term that appears in some Mesopotamian texts of Shabbatu. Shabbatu or Shabbatu looks a lot like the Hebrew Shabbat, from which we get the English word Sabbath. And furthermore, there are some philological oddities, some linguistic oddities about the Hebrew word that can be explained by reference to this notion that it's a borrowing from the Akkadian word Shabbatu, which Akkadian being the Semitic language of Mesopotamia, related to Hebrew, but obviously a different language. Now, the problem is that Mesopotamian Shabbatu is a monthly occurrence. It's not a weekly occurrence. It occurs at the middle of the lunar month, so about the 15th of the month, you have the Shabbatu. Some scholars think that when you have the expressions Chodesh v'Shabbat, new moon and Shabbat, in some pre-exilic texts, some relatively early texts in the Bible, that Shabbat there does not mean the weekly Sabbath. It means this monthly event, the day of the full moon. So the Chodesh v'Shabbat would mean the day of the new moon, what Jews tend today to call Rosh Chodesh, the new moon, which begins the new month, and the full moon 2 weeks later. And there's some reasons to suspect that that may be the case in those few texts which I analyze in chapter 2 of the book, which is in fact the most technical chapter in Israel's Day of Light and Joy. And I was surprised to see when I did the research on this that among European scholars, this hypothesis that the weekly Sabbath originates in this Mesopotamian day of the full moon is very widely accepted. So in that case, in their theory, the change from a monthly to a weekly referent would be post-exilic, only after the exile, only after, let's say, 6th century BCE, as you're heading towards what you might call the late period in the history of biblical literature, would you have seen the term applied to a regular weekly event rather than to a monthly event. I think there's some problems with this. First of all, how do you get from a monthly event to a weekly event? The lunar month is 29 and a half days from one new moon to the next. It's not a clean multiple of 7. It's hard to see how the transition came about. People have speculated as to how it came about, but we really don't have any evidence for that. There's no place in the Hebrew Bible, as far as I can see, where the term Shabbat necessarily means a monthly event, the day of the full moon. The place where it can be read that way, maybe it should be read that way in those texts, but there's no place where you have to read it that way. So I would call this a tantalizing theory, a very interesting theory. Now, it's possible to me that the ancient Israelites had a an event every 7 days, a special sacred day every 7 days, and that eventually the name of this Mesopotamian day lent that the Mesopotamian day lent its name to the Israelite day. So they started calling the seventh day, Yom HaShvi'i, they started calling Shabbat. This is possible. The Mesopotamian day had a kind of propitiatory, ascetic character. It wasn't a happy day. It was a day of keeping a low profile so as to pacify the angry gods. And it's interesting that if you look in ancient Judaism, you can see some evidence for fasting and abstention from sex on the Shabbat, on the weekly Sabbath. That's very unlike current practice, where feasting is part of the day. There are 3 mandatory meals in the rabbinic Sabbath, and where it's considered Friday night is considered an ideal time for marital relations. So I suggest in the book, very tentatively, I admit, that it may be the case that that the name and some of the ascetic practices of the Mesopotamian Shabbatu carried over and were reflected in the Israelite Sabbath. But again, this is all quite speculative and can't be taken as hard and settled fact.
Uh-huh. That's so interesting, John.
I hope it's not too
You,
complex. It's pretty complex. It gets into the weeds of some
yeah.
philological detail. But I think it's important not simply to say, as some scholars do, oh, it originated in the Mesopotamian Shabbatu, which is the day, the 15th of the lunar month.
Uh-huh. That makes a lot of sense, although it can be quite complex for people who can really deal with the tensions that the what other arguments may be thrown out in there. So yeah, it makes sense. But you also bring a spanner in there, in terms of how the Sabbath would have evolved, particularly in the Second Temple period, in relation to the emergence of the Jewish sects like the Pharisees, the Qumran sect, or the community that lived by the Dead Sea. So how did it actually evolve, particularly with the Second Temple period, where we have these sects emerging?
Well, I'm glad you mentioned sects, Pastor Cliff, although I actually brought it up in my answer to the previous question, uh, but where I said that the Friday night is considered in rabbinic literature an ideal time for sects. But if you're meaning SECTS, then I would say this. Certainly in the Second Temple period, the Sabbath, the weekly Sabbath, has become a central marker of Jewish identity, along with ritual circumcision and kashrut, the dietary laws. It became a prime marker of Jewishness. And a lot of law then develops to define and protect it. There may have been more law around in the earlier biblical period that actually appears in the biblical texts. I think there almost certainly was. But much law was, excuse me, was to develop to define and protect what the observance of the Sabbath really is. Eventually, 2 full tractates in the Talmud are devoted to the Sabbath. I mean, after all, what is work? Is work just gainful employment? Are you observing the Sabbath if you're retired or unemployed or a child or disabled and don't do any work? You don't get any salary for labor? Really? I think that doesn't make it into a sacred day. That doesn't make it into a special day. And so one gets a sense of what the observance of it actually entails from these Second Temple texts, these texts in the 5th, 4th, 3rd, 2nd, 1st century BCE, maybe even into the 1st century CE. So, what about another example would be what about warfare on the Sabbath? Could you conduct warfare on the Sabbath? If the Sabbath was being widely observed in biblical times, you would have expected texts that addressed that question. You would have seen David's armies, for example, laying off warfare as the seventh day approached. You would have seen the Israelites, as they're conquering Canaan in the book of Joshua, ceasing to fight on the Sabbath, or at least addressing the question of whether you could fight on the Sabbath. But interestingly enough, that subject only comes up in First Maccabees. It doesn't come up before First Maccabees, suggesting that it's now a new issue because the Sabbath has become much more prominent and much more important and much more defined by law than it was in earlier periods. So a lot of law develops. In terms of different sects, and as I say, Jews had a lot of sects in the Second Temple period. Probably some still do. differences in understanding Shabbat became major sites of conflict. Can you fast on the Sabbath? Can you abstain from sex? How about a fire? Can you allow a fire started before the Sabbath to burn on the Sabbath, or do you have to put it out before the Sabbath comes? There's even the subject that comes up in Josephus in his description of the Essenes. Josephus is a Jewish historian writing in Greek towards the end of the first century of the Common Era. And Josephus says that there was a group called the Essenes, which we know a little bit about, not much, who would not relieve themselves. They would not go to the toilet, at least they would not at least defecate, I think people usually say, on the Sabbath, which is a problem. I mean, I can imagine that's a serious problem. That's unattested, as far as I know, anywhere else in any ancient Jewish literature. I always think that it violates one of the most memorable verses in the Bible, which is where Moses says to Pharaoh, "Let my people go." You're telling me that this for 25-hour period from Friday around nightfall until maybe an hour or so after nightfall on Saturday, you mean to tell me these Jews are not defecating? That could be a very unpleasant day. But then again, how widespread that was, or what Josephus's information is on that point, is very hard to guess. So the bottom line is, the observance of the Sabbath becomes a site of sectarian conflict between various Jewish groups, and I think some of the narratives in the New Testament fall into that same category.
That's so interesting, because there's a lot of debate about what people can and cannot do, particularly on the Sabbath. And it can really drive people into different directions.
Yeah,
And as soon as
because
you
they're
start,
trying to preserve the sanctity and specialness of the day. So,
yes,
how far does that go, and what does it actually entail?
you describe the Sabbath, John, as a sanctuary in time, which is a phrase quite familiar with, used by Rabbi Heschel in his book, The Sabbath. And how does this concept shape Jewish identity, especially in contrast to spatial holiness, like the temple, for example?
I think Heschel's book, Abraham Joshua Heschel's book, The Sabbath, Its Meaning for Modern Man, is really a great book, a beautiful little book. I highly recommend it. I do think that his time-space dichotomy, the opposition of time and space, the polarity of time and space that drives that whole book, is ill-considered. I don't think it holds up very well. The Sabbath is very much rooted in place. Observance of the Sabbath involves being rooted in place. There are restrictions on how far a Jew can walk, restrictions on carrying in a public domain. There's something about the Sabbath that suggests recreating the atmosphere of the temple, an atmosphere of spiritual peace, the confidence in God's provision, a life free of anxiety, even though only, unfortunately, true temporarily. I mean, think of something like the 23rd Psalm. There's something about the enactment of that spiritual peace, which is part of the message, or the ideal of the Sabbath. But I think setting time against space really destroys that, because if there's no limit on space, if things in space are totally irrelevant, then really you could travel on the Sabbath, you could do all kinds of things on the Sabbath that destroy that rootedness in place. Actually, excuse me, Heschel backed off from that dichotomy in his later book, Israel, an Echo of Eternity, which he wrote after the Six-Day War in 1967, where he talks about the land and the sacrality, the sanctity of the land, and its special place in Jewish memory. So I'd recommend the Sabbath, Its Meaning for Modern Man. I would not recommend the time-space dichotomy that threads its way through that whole book.
You mentioned something quite earlier about the Sabbath being a covenantal sign, between God and man, or God and Israel. How does this theological understanding persist or even change in post-biblical Judaism?
Yes, that's often said, that the Sabbath is a covenantal sign between God and the people of Israel, akin to circumcision as the covenantal sign between God and the Abrahamic people in Genesis 17, or the rainbow as a sign of the covenant in Genesis 9, the universal covenant between God and all humanity. But the truth is that in the Bible itself, in Exodus 31, the Sabbath is actually presented as a sign that God is the one who has consecrated the people of Israel. Ani Hashem mekadeshchem. I am the one who has made you holy. The Jews observe the Sabbath. The Jews keep the Sabbath sacred as a sign that God has made them sacred. So I think Brit in that passage doesn't mean covenant so much as obligation. It's an eternal obligation upon the Jewish people to observe the Sabbath. Now, in post-biblical Judaism, both of these ideas persist. The idea of the consecrated people, the specialists of the Jewish people, but the obligation of that consecrated people to themselves to consecrate and to observe the Sabbath day. And there it's taken as an everlasting norm, as a brit olam, an everlasting obligation, a mitzvah, something that Jews are required to do. So I think that there's some misreading of Exodus 31, that people simply think it's a sign of the covenant between God and Israel. Indirectly, it's that, but it's most directly a sign of the special consecrated status of the people of Israel and their corollary obligation to sanctify the Sabbath, to consecrate the Sabbath as in turn on their own part.
Uh-huh. Now we know you and I live in modernity, where a lot of
I
people
try to
make.
avoid it. I try my best to stay in the past, but it keeps catching up with me with things like podcasts and video interviews.
I know, because you've been working on the Sabbath for a long time, right?
Oh, well, I try not to work on the Sabbath. I did. There were periods, though, when I was writing this book, when I was working on the Sabbath 6 days a week.
uh, yeah. So tell me, John. You make this argument. I mean, we know we can avoid it. We live in this secularized society, where many people may argue that the Sabbath may be in decline. So, do you see perhaps in that setting the Sabbath as a fundamental religious obligation, or can it hold meaning to some people that are maybe identify as secular?
The Sabbath, as classically understood in Judaism, or for that matter, the Sabbath as classically understood in Christianity, which is a rather different matter, went into steep decline 250 years ago with the Enlightenment, what in Jewish history tends to be called the emancipation, the increasing civic enfranchisement of the Jews, and the increasing possibilities of economic opportunities and social integration and all the cultural pressures that necessarily brings with it. So it's in that sense, whereas the vast majority of Jews would have been quite Sabbath observant 250 years ago, today it's a minority. So there's a whole set of social, economic, intellectual reasons, legal reasons, or why that became the case. Interestingly enough, today you do see some countercurrent of Jews reclaiming traditional Sabbath observance. I think partly brought about by this new invention called the weekend. Pastor Cliff, I don't like the term weekend because the week has two ends, one at each. It's got its last day, which is Saturday, and its first day, which is Sunday. So the weekend includes Saturday and Sunday. I would call it the weekend start. It's the end of one week and the start of the next. But in any event, if you can take off Saturday, if you don't have to work Saturday, and you have a type of profession where you could do that, then in fact the possibility of Sabbath observance becomes more real than it was 100 years ago or even 50 years ago. So in that sense, you do see some reclaiming of it. You see some reclaiming of it by Christians. There are some books that speak about reclaiming the Sabbath for Christians. It's not for me to prescribe for secular Jews or for Christians how they should observe the Sabbath, or any secular person. What I can say is that it's hard for me to see what such a deeply theologically charged and theocentric institution as the Sabbath can possibly mean in a time of secularization. If one tries to secularize the Sabbath, that's sort of like saying, well, we're going to consider physics, we're just going to leave out gravity. I think the day is too involved in God and God's will and ancient ideas like sanctity, like consecration, like commandment, to survive secularization. In other words, a lot of people think, oh, it's a day off. It's a day to spend time with the family, a day to have fun. Well, ideally, on the Sabbath, one should take off and spend time with the family and maybe have some fun too. But the essence of it is more theologically charged, more theologically serious than that. So I'm inclined to think that it probably will not have great meaning for secular Jews. But again, if it does, fine, or for secular Gentiles. If it does, fine. Far be it from me to be critical.
Uh-huh. You mentioned the two ends. I mean, Saturday and Sunday. As you know, this explanation you give to the term you don't like, weekend. We know a lot of Christians have adopted the Sabbath into Sunday, what they call the Lord's Day,
Right.
and also Islam has the Friday prayers, but we don't have anything equivalent to what would have in the Sabbath according to Judaism. How does then Judaism's conception of the Sabbath remain unique among the Abrahamic faith?
Oh, big question. Good question too. Ultimately, every religion has aspects that are unique and aspects that are more widely shared. Claims of radical uniqueness, radical distinctiveness, radical innovation usually fall down under historical scrutiny. They should be suspect. As for Shabbos or Shabbat, as Jews call the Sabbath, well, it's on the seventh day of the week. It's not on the first day, which the Christian Lord's Day is. Sunday is the first day of the week. Nor is it on the sixth day of the week, which is when public prayers take place, the big Friday prayers in Muslim tradition. It's on Saturday. The Jewish Sabbath is on Saturday, Friday evening till Saturday night. And in it, the home and synagogue are equally central. I find a lot of people, at least in America, when they think of the Sabbath, they say, oh, that's the day when you go to synagogue. That's the day when you go to the temple. Well, yes, but the essence of Sabbatarian practice, sabbatical practice, observing the Sabbath, is as much a matter of the home as of the synagogue. It's not just a place of public worship. In that sense, I suspect it's rather different from the Muslim case, but I don't really know for sure. And probably different from the Christian's case of, let's say, Catholics going to Mass on Sunday. But it's not primarily or exclusively in the synagogue that the Sabbath takes place. In fact, in traditional Jewish law, one should not violate the law of the Sabbath to go to the synagogue for Sabbath services. That would be a contradiction in terms in the understanding of classical Talmudic law and the way it's applied principally by Orthodox Jews today. And of course, the Jewish Sabbath has its own rhythm. I mentioned earlier the three meals, Shalosh Su'udot, a meal Friday night after services at home, a leisurely, festive meal with singing, with some sort of spiritual discourse, etc. And then another meal around lunchtime on Saturday, again after services, if the person went to services, again with a festive fare and with singing and with perhaps some sort of Devar Torah, some sort of little sermonette, some inspirational comment about what's been read that week in the lectionary cycle. And then there's a third meal, which is before the Sabbath lets out, late Saturday afternoon or early Saturday evening. There's a whole third meal. In other words, you might call Saturday dinner is advanced earlier so that it still falls within the Sabbath. There may still be a Saturday dinner afterwards, but that's a different matter. That's not the observance of the Sabbath. So that has its own distinct rhythm, which I don't think you find closely paralleled in Islam or Christianity. But Islam and Christianity have their own observances and their own claims to sanctity, and there are similarities in these three institutions that you mentioned, but also the differences have to be respected.
To ensure that we keep bringing you tough conversations like these, please support our ministry by donating as little as 50 Rand per month. You can find our banking details on our website, pulusoministries.co.za.
I know there are some other Christian theologians who have written extensively on the Sabbath, and they present it as a command and a gift from God. Are there any Christian interpretations, John, that you find that you resonate with them or are problematic in their presentation of the Sabbath, in thinking about the Jewish Sabbath? I mean, at the top of my head, I can think of groups like the Seventh Day Baptist, the Seventh Day Adventist, and so forth.
Right.
What is your take on that?
Well, my concern in Israel's Day of Light and Joy is more generally with the Jewish Sabbath, not the Christian one, which is, I say, really quite different, although I do mention it. I can say a few things that may surprise Christian readers or readers who know the Sabbath only from Christian tradition. For one thing, nothing ascribed to Jesus in the New Testament recommends changing the day, changing the Sabbath from, I don't know, from Saturday to Sunday. There's nothing Jesus says in the New Testament advocates abolishing the Sabbath. Nothing there advocates interpreting it as not governed by some community law, some law and community standards. There can be disagreements over what the law and community standards are. As for Christian theologians, it's be very hard for me to advise Christians not to read figures like Karl Barth or whatever who've written on that type of subject, but I'm really not knowledgeable enough on that to make any intelligent recommendations. My advice would be, excuse me, 1 second. My advice would be to avoid carrying on ancient caricatures about the Pharisees or the scribes or whatever. Ancient Christian caricatures about observant Jews who are often presented, especially the Pharisees, are often presented in the New Testament as hypocrites, self-righteous, power-hungry hypocrites, or something like that. Or even a kind of demonic anti-force to the altogether benign, uh, godly force of Jesus. These are stereotypes, these are caricatures, these arise in contexts of polemic. Every religion engages in polemic against its competitors. Every culture does that. Political parties do that. Everybody does that. If you want to learn about the Jewish Sabbath, what I think the Christians should do is to recognize, first of all, recognize the anti-Jewish bias in their own scriptures. Don't just replicate them. It's not to say there's nothing they can take over from the Jewish Sabbath, but they're never going to reach that point if they don't recognize the Jewish Sabbath for what it was and is, or if they simply perceive it through these ancient, regrettable polemics. I think in this world, this post-Vatican II world, this modern world of which many people aspire to mutual respect, I think it's possible to do that, to adhere to one's scriptures, to treasure one's scriptures, but to recognize historically inaccurate claims that arise in the anger of polemic. And that would be my one advice to Christians who seek to uh, to encounter the Jewish Sabbath and to imagine what it might mean for them.
I think you bring a quite important factors here, John. You know, because a lot of people tend to kind of miss or de-Judaize Jesus, because I mean he was a Jew himself, and he would have been a Sabbath observer. As I mean, picking up from the Hebrew Bible, there would have been a text that he would have identified with and read in most cases, and it's important for people to recognize the anti-Semitism that may pop up or interpretations that are pretty much anti-Semitic in terms of labeling the Pharisees as hypocrites and all that. I mean, if the Pharisees were not there, we probably pretty much would not have the both testaments that we have today. The Hebrew Bible specifically, it's from their works.
It's also, yeah, that's right, and the Hebrew Bible suffuses the New Testament. Much of the New Testament is what in Jewish discourse we call midrash, as say biblical interpretation, reworking biblical text, narrativizing biblical text, and so forth and so on. And I would just point out texts like Matthew 23, if I remember the chapter correctly, where Jesus says, do what the Pharisees say because they sit in the chair, the cathedra, the chair from which we get the English word
Instead of
cathedral,
Moses, yeah,
the chair of Moses. That
yeah.
suggests some strand of early Christianity, perhaps of Jesus himself, which is very sympathetic to the authority of the Pharisees as carrying on the Mosaic tradition. It looks a lot like what in Jewish and rabbinic discourse they call the oral law, the Torah Sheba'al Peh. And that a text like that has to be given its due as well.
Uh-huh. John, you and I live in an era. I mean, we know with AI, artificial intelligence, the connectivity of our cell phones, we have all these social medias and all that. You name them. There's a lot of them. Plethora of competition along them, and workaholism that we find ourselves in, and most people find themselves in. How does the Sabbath then um, offer this counter-cultural model that we find ourselves in to remind us of rest and mindfulness, even for people who may not be Jews themselves?
Well, in classical Jewish halakha, classical Jewish law, especially as it governs the Sabbath, uh, the truth is that connecting an electrical current or disconnecting electrical current is forbidden on the Sabbath. So to Jews who are traditionally observant, uh, disconnecting is something they do once a week for a period of, as I say, about 25 hours. I think today the notion of spiritual freedom is more important than ever. And the reason is that people are, in fact, addicted, as you say, workaholic, but also people are just plain addicted to their devices. I saw a statistic recently said that in America, I think it's the average college student, if I remember correctly, checks his or her cell phone 113 times a day, reaches for it and activates the cell phone 113 times a day. Uh, I was surprised it was so low. You see them walking along the streets, at least over here, looking at the phone. They're lucky they don't walk right into people. Sometimes they do. It's very dangerous, but it has become an addiction. And so the question is, how do you break that addiction? That's where someone like Heschel, already 75 years ago, was very uh, prescient in warning against the dangers of technology and overestimating technology, imagining that technology can provide us some sort of spiritual freedom or elevation of human life and society, and produce some sort of progress of a moral nature, warning against all that and saying, no, actually, there are great dangers in technology. And that's a note that he sounded, as I say, 75 years ago, but now in 1998, the late Pope John Paul II uh, published a document in which he echoed that, quoted Heschel, cited Heschel, and expanded on it, and said that this is one of the things that Christians, in this case Catholics, need to consider relative to the Sabbath. The name of the document was Dies Domini, the day of the Lord, referring to Sunday, a very Christian interpretation, obviously, of the Sabbath as Sunday, connecting it to the Mass and all that sort of thing that you expect a Pope to do. But he does bring in this notion of liberation from technology. Uh, do I think a secular Sabbath, that some people talk about a secular digital Sabbath, will much resemble the powerful spiritual and social institution the Jews have called Shabbat or Shabbos, although these many centuries? Probably not. I think a digital Sabbath is more likely to be more like a kind of New Year's resolution or a resolution to go on a diet or whatever. It can work. In some cases, it can work, but it won't have the social force, the communal social force, and the religious spiritual focus of the Jewish Sabbath. So I'm not against the digital Sabbath. I deal with this in the 8th chapter of Israel's Day of Life and Joy, the Day of Light and Joy. But uh, I'm doubtful that you could have a Sabbath that's only focused on the digital aspect. I don't think that's going to catch on at any mass level.
Uh-huh. John, in recent times, we have had the emergence of, womanist thinking and womanist theologians, from various traditions, whether from Christianity, Judaism. But what I'm interested in asking you is how have, Jewish feminist thinkers interpreted or reinterpreted the Sabbath rituals, such as candle lighting, to reflect the modern day values while maintaining the traditions that we find in the Jewish Sabbath?
I think there's a wide range of answers to that. Uh, Classically, in Jewish practice, candle lighting the candles before the Sabbath comes in as a sign of inaugurating the Sabbath, That is classically a woman's task. The woman of the house should do that. If there's no woman in the house, the man should do it, obviously. This was true long before modern feminism. I mean, there's a wide range of responses to feminism in Judaism. In some cases, synagogues now have two morning services. So one parent can stay home with the underage children while the other goes off to the services. And then it comes home and the other one goes. And the first one takes care of the children. The notion, I think in general, the notion of the synagogue as a man's place and the home as the woman's place, that has declined in regard to the Sabbath, just as it's declined everywhere else, almost everywhere else in society. There are strongly traditional Jewish groups where the classical pattern is alive and well, and those groups, because of a high birth rate and a high retention rate, are actually growing from a small base. They are actually growing. But in general, you'd have to say that the Sabbath has become more egalitarian as regards gender in response to these feminist pressures that you're talking about. I think the day when the wife is a housewife who stays home and cooks, and the husband goes off to the office and comes home and just in time for the Sabbath to start, I think that is much less the pattern today than it used to be, and the idea of the woman working and the husband cooking and so forth is certainly very much in evidence in a lot of circles in Judaism.
Uh-huh. I mean, to latch on that as well, we have Israel society that has an ongoing debate about public Sabbath observance. For example, you have the closure of businesses, public transportation, whether they should be functioning or not on the Sabbath. How do you see, the balance between this religious tradition and pluralism that is playing out in discussions that are taking place about the Sabbath, particularly in Israeli society?
Well, it's a very big question because it relates to the issue of religion and state. That's true in just about every country in the world. Certainly, it's true in the United States. For example, in America, there are banks that tend to be closed. Government offices are closed on Sunday. So the closing of public transportation in Israel, which is not true everywhere in Israel, and very similar sorts of controversies are very much flashpoints in Israeli society, flashpoints between the more secular Jews and non-Jews, and the non-Jews on the one hand, and the more observant Jews, some of whom are I could say traditional but not highly observant, who still want the Sabbath publicly to be recognized. So this is one of a number of flashpoints that are still around, still very much around. For example, should the more traditional students of Talmud who are studying Talmud, you might say professionally, 10, 12 hours a day or more, should they be exempt from military service, which traditionally they have been? This is a flashpoint of a much larger controversy in Israel. In general, because the differences in birth rate and other factors really matter, I think religious communities in Israel over the last couple of decades have become more prominent and more influential. That's certainly compared to where they were a few decades ago. But what the future holds is very hard to say. As I say, every society has these disputes. In Christian societies, is Sunday a day just like any other day? I think in very few societies would that be the case, where they simply have a 7-day work week. In Muslim societies and the prayers that occur on Friday at that time of day, can people not take off from work? Again, I suspect it's a complicated question that depends on the particular country and the particular legal order. So issues like that are always in flux because of the different interests that people have. Excuse me. In the case of the Sabbath in Israel, well, the Sabbath is very much a communal social institution, as I mentioned, and therefore to say, well, observe it yourself at home, but there's no problem with the bus stopping in front of your house. There are people who feel that the bus stopping in front of their house is impairing the peace and tranquility of their Sabbath, and they'd like to prevent that. But that gets into all kinds of questions of civil liberties, as I say, the separation of religion and state.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. John, I know you've worked a lot on the Sabbath, and you've spent time studying the Sabbath over the years, and how has your personal observance of the Sabbath or understanding kind of evolved over this time that you have been embedded yourself in studying this uh, day of joy and delight?
Oh, I always find myself enriched by my encounters with the sources, biblical, rabbinic, medieval, modern, whatever. But it would be hard for me to specify any particular change I've made in response to them. To be that specific would be difficult for me. I would stress to your viewership that in Judaism, the Sabbath is not just a private spiritual practice, to say it probably the third or fourth time. It's a communal institution, and it's best learned and appreciated in a social setting. So to some extent, one's social life, one's social connections are deeply interconnected with one's congregational and religious life, and all the more so on the Sabbath when someone like me is disconnected from electronic devices and from the much of the rest of the modern world, and seeking or substituting for that actual human contact. So that I think is an important part of any sort of personal observance. The personal observance is learned through a social setting, the way anything, language, anything is to some degree learned through a social setting. But it does change one's sociability and one's relationship to other people. And of course, as I say, to those ancient sources that are the focus of congregational life to a large measure as well.
John, we're running out of time, but perhaps as a parting question, what would be this key takeaway that you would like readers that they would glean from this book as they pick it up and read it? What would be that one thing you'd like them to take away?
The one thing I'd like them to take away is an actual copy of the book that they purchased. That would be the main takeaway I would suggest. Whether they read it or not, I mean, that's their own business. I mean, no, seriously, that's a tough question. I would say the answer lies in the importance of recognizing the interconnection and the symbiosis of practice and belief. That's why twice in this book I quote the Jewish theologian Franz Rosenzweig, who died in 1929 in Germany. He said, talking about Torah observance in general, the observance of the norms, the commandments of the Bible. He says, we know it only when we do, with the word do in italics. We know it when we do it. Some things can't really be known purely cognitively. The Jewish Sabbath, practiced correctly, creates a kind of ritual alternative to the world defined by the more familiar world you and I know, which is dominated by acquisition, the desire for status, dominance, etc. So in Israel's Day of Light and Joy, I try to show how it does that, how the Sabbath presents an alternative model. Temporary, there has to be acquisition, commerce, status, ambition, competition. Those things have to exist in for any society to thrive and advance, for human needs to be met. But they shouldn't be absolutized. And in this book, I try to show a way that in this one special day a week, they're not absolutized, and some other spiritual reality, ideally, comes to dominate.
John, it has certainly been great having you on the show, and it's always a pleasure to have you. You always bring these, fascinating insights, and I would encourage our audience to pick up the book and read the book for themselves to glean some of the concepts you talk about in the book. I think it's a very good read and a very edifying text that you have produced, and for that I commend you. Thank you very much for that.
Well, thank you very much for having me. I always appreciate your very learned and stimulating and insightful questions, Pastor Cliff.
Thank you, John. And to our audience, certainly hope you've enjoyed this. Keep on subscribing so that you can get notification as we upload this kind of information. And stay blessed. And until next time, God bless.
Puluso Ministries is a non-profit educational enterprise founded in 2019. The ministry is informed by academic scholarship. At Puluso, we embrace multiple perspectives in our engagement with Scripture. We seek to provide non-Christians and Christians from all backgrounds and denominations with resources that provide an honest intellectual engagement with the Bible. We embrace multiple perspectives in fostering a more open, moderate society into the 21st century and beyond.